The first time I saw the cabin, I thought it was just a place to rest for a night, a random shelter in the middle of nowhere. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly ahead, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. I was tired physically and mentally. My job, my life, everything felt like it was falling apart. A little time away from the world seemed like exactly what I needed. No plans.
No commitments.
Just me, the car, and the open road. I wasn't expecting much when I spotted the cabin off to the side of the road. It was tucked away behind some trees, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It wasn't a place on any map, no signs pointing the way, just a small wooden building hidden in the woods. I slowed the car down, my headlights illuminating the road ahead. The cabin looked old, not run down, but definitely aged, with its brown wood fading under the years of wear. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch had a couple of loose boards, but it seemed solid enough. And more importantly, it seemed like the only place for miles that I could rest for the night. I pulled the car over to the edge of the dirt road and parked. The area was quiet, eerily so, with only the sounds of crickets and the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. The air was heavy, like the pressure before a storm, but there was no storm in sight. I grabbed my bag, got out of the car, and made my way to the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The inside smelled like old wood and dust, but there was a warmth to it, comfort I didn't expect. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it wasn't run down either. A simple kitchen with a stove, a sink, and a small table. A couch near the window with a wool blanket draped over it. The kind of place that felt lived in, but not overly personal. No photos, no mementos, just the bare necessities. I could tell someone had been here recently. The dust wasn't thick, and there was a stack of firewood next to the fireplace. I walked around the cabin, checking it out, but there wasn't anything too strange. Just the usual stuff you'd expect from a remote cabin. A small bathroom, a bed with an old quilt, a couple of chairs by the fire. I unpacked my things and started a small fire in the fireplace, hoping the warmth would help me unwind. The heat felt nice, but the stillness of the cabin made me uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was a place meant to bring peace, but all I could hear was the wind outside, pushing against the cabin walls like it was trying to get in. After a while, I decided to go to bed. I didn't expect to sleep well, but exhaustion quickly took over. I lay there, under the old quilt, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to ignore the creaks and groans of the building. The sounds of the night, wind rustling the trees, branches scraping against the walls, kept me awake longer than I'd like to admit. But eventually, sleep took me. I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. I lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. Didn't. The tapping continued, louder now, like someone or something was knocking on the glass. I slowly sat up in bed, my heart racing. The air felt different now, colder, heavier. I got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, trying not to make a sound. I peeked through the curtains, half expecting to see a raccoon or a bird, but there was nothing out there. Just the trees, swaying in the wind, their branches creaking under the pressure. I took a deep breath and pulled the curtain open. Nothing, just darkness beyond the window. I frowned, my mind working in overdrive to come up with a logical explanation. It had to be the wind, right? But then, as I turned away from the window, I heard the tapping again, this time from the door. I froze. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced. The tapping was too precise, too intentional. It wasn't the wind. I had to know what it was. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly made my way to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but I forced myself to turn it. The door creaked open, and I stepped outside into the cool night air. It first, I didn't see anything, just the porch, the darkness, and the trees around me. The tapping stopped, leaving only the rustling of the leaves. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it all. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the woods just beyond the edge of the porch. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as I looked closer, I could make out more details. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long arms hanging at its sides. The shape was almost human, but not quite. Its head was too large, its body too thin. It was completely still, just watching me. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. Couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, staring at me. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, but then it was gone. Just like that, it disappeared into the darkness of the woods. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get back inside and lock the door, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind me. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't know what that thing was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying here any longer. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to be careful or organized. I had to get out of there. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The last thing I wanted was to be out in the woods at night, but I didn't see any other option. The cabin had become a trap, and I was desperate to escape. I threw my bag into the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. But as I drove away from the cabin, something felt wrong. The road was the same, but it seemed different somehow. The trees seemed to close in on me, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. In the reflection, I saw the figure again, standing at the edge of the cabin. It was watching me as I drove away, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I didn't stop. I kept driving, my foot heavy on the gas pedal. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and every turn felt like I was going deeper into the woods. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the feeling of being watched faded. The trees thinned out, and I saw the first signs of civilization in the distance. The road was still long, but I wasn't as scared anymore. I didn't know what had happened back there, but I was out of the woods now, safe. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was physically exhausted, but emotionally drained. I pulled into a small motel parking lot, checked in, and collapsed onto the bed. I thought I could finally sleep, but as I closed my eyes, I heard it, a tapping on the window. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought the weekend getaway to the cabin would be the perfect escape. Just a few days away from the noise of the city, a chance to relax and get some peace. The idea of nature, the mountains, and the isolation sounded ideal. I rented the cabin online, and I didn't think much about it. The photos showed a cozy, rustic place nestled deep in the woods, far enough from town to feel remote, but not so far that you couldn't get help if needed. The reviews were positive enough, quiet and peaceful, a great place to unwind. Perfect if you want to disconnect. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, following the GPS directions. The road became less paved the closer I got to the cabin. I could feel the car bouncing along the uneven terrain, and the trees around me started to grow thicker. The air smelled different here, cleaner, almost crisp, but also a little earthy. Something familiar, something wild. When I arrived, I saw the cabin for the first time. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. A small wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around the front. It was nestled against a hill, surrounded by trees that seemed to go on forever. There was no one around, not even other cabins nearby. Just a peaceful, quiet emptiness. It felt isolated, but not in a threatening way, at least not yet. I unloaded my things into the cabin and took in my surroundings. The inside was just as cozy as it appeared in the photos. Old wooden beams, a stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and a large window at the back that looked out over a small creek. It was charming, no doubt about that. But the more I looked around, the more I realized how remote this place truly was. No neighbors, no cell service, no Wi-Fi. Just me, a few trees, and the sounds of birds and wind. I started a fire in the fireplace and settled into one of the chairs. I unpacked my bag, put on some music to fill the silence, and just let myself sink into the atmosphere. I was looking forward to having the whole weekend to myself. It was going to be great. The first evening passed uneventfully. I made dinner, read a book, and went to bed early, enjoying the feeling of being away from the world. But something strange happened as I lay there, drifting off to sleep. There was a noise. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper on the wind. I strained to hear it, unsure if it was just my imagination or something else. But then it became clearer, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it. It was coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the sound of tree branches scraping against the walls in the wind. But this was different. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the woods. I peered out into the dark, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, just the shadows of branches swaying gently. The tapping stopped. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe the house was settling. I convinced myself that it was nothing, so I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. But the tapping didn't stop there. The next morning, I woke up early and had breakfast by the fire. I spent the day outside, hiking through the woods, enjoying the solitude. There was a quiet beauty to the landscape, the way the trees stood tall and still, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. It was peaceful, and it allowed me to let go of the stress that had built up in my life. For a while, it felt like everything was right, but by that evening, the feeling had shifted. I couldn't quite explain why, but there was something off about the cabin now. It wasn't the noise from the night before, though that still lingered in the back of my mind. It was more the air, the way the trees seemed to grow thicker as the light started to fade. The shadows felt longer, darker, and the silence, there was something unnerving about it. The wind had stopped, the birds had stopped singing, and it felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I tried to ignore the unease that was creeping up on me, so I decided to take another walk. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my skin, and I breathed deeply, trying to clear my head. The sky was turning dark, the stars slowly emerging in the vastness above. I started walking toward the creek, hoping the sound of running water would calm my mind. But as I approached the water, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the edge of the creek. It wasn't human, not really. It was too still, too rigid, and the way it stood with its back to me made my skin crawl. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its arms were stretched out at an odd angle, almost like it was reaching for something that I couldn't see. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at this thing. I tried to tell myself that it was just a tree or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took a step back, slowly, trying not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter, but before I could take another step, the figure turned. It wasn't a person, at least not in any way I could understand. Its face was a twisted mess, like something that had been half-formed and left to decay. The skin was pale and stretched too tight, its eyes black holes that seemed to absorb all light. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a horrible, gurgling noise. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. My feet were clumsy, stumbling over rocks and branches as I sprinted back toward the cabin. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel it, whatever that thing was, following me, getting closer with each step. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against me, trying to drag me down. My heart pounded in my chest, and I thought for sure I wouldn't make it back. But somehow I did. I burst through the door of the cabin, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, breathless and shaking. I checked the locks, all of them, and then I sat on the floor, trying to calm myself down. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Was it just the isolation playing tricks on me? But the feeling, the fear, those were real. I knew what I had seen. That night, the tapping returned. I tried to block it out, to ignore it, but it was no use. It was louder now, closer. Came from all directions. The roof, the walls, the windows. It was like the cabin itself was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of the tapping. I could hear it even through the thick walls, tapping and scraping, like fingers dragging along the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and made a decision. I was leaving. I didn't care what time it was. I didn't care how far the drive was. I just needed to get out of there. As I started the car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The windows were dark, but I swear I saw something moving in the shadows. I didn't wait to find out what it was. The road felt endless as I drove, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. It was late, but I found a small motel and checked in. The woman behind the counter looked at me strangely, but I didn't care. I just needed a bed, some peace. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could explain. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night trying to sleep, I can still hear the tapping. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It's out there. It all started with a simple invitation. A friend of a friend had this cabin tucked away in the mountains. An isolated place, no neighbors for miles. The kind of quiet you'd only find in the middle of nowhere. Sounded perfect. I had been stressed for weeks and just wanted some time to clear my head, to be alone.
No distractions.
Just the peace of nature and the hum of the forest surrounding me. I packed my things, grabbed a few supplies, and hit the road. The drive was longer than I expected. The sun was starting to set, and the roads grew narrower and more winding as I climbed higher into the hills. My GPS was starting to lose signal, and I wasn't exactly sure how much further I had to go. But I didn't mind. I enjoyed being in the car, the air growing colder with every passing mile. The last stretch of the road had been gravel, and now I was driving through trees, the darkening sky almost hiding the road entirely. Then, out of nowhere, there it was, the cabin. It stood there, nestled among the trees, a small wooden structure with a slanted roof, its windows glowing with a soft yellow light. It looked exactly like something from one of those old films. Isolated, quiet, and a little eerie, but I didn't mind. I was ready for the peace it promised. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and headed for the front door. The steps creaked under my weight as I pushed the door open, and the musty smell of old wood greeted me. Inside, it was dark at first, but a few lamps gave the space a warm, inviting glow. The cabin was small but cozy. A few chairs by the fireplace, a rustic kitchen, and a loft area with a bed. There was a stack of firewood near the hearth, and a couple of bookshelves lined the walls. Felt homey. Not the fancy kind of home, but the kind where you could kick back and just exist without worrying about anything else. I sighed in relief and set my bag down. I spent the first couple of hours just exploring. There was a deck outside with a view of the valley, stretching out into the darkening woods. It was so quiet. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant call of an owl. I thought about sitting out there for a while, but the air had a chill to it, so I opted for the fireplace inside instead. The first night was peaceful. I made some soup, watched the flames dance in the fire, and let myself drift into a kind of contentment. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I had everything I needed. It was the second night when things started to get strange. I had been sitting by the fire, reading a book I found on one of the shelves. It was getting late, but I wasn't tired. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees, making the old cabin creak and groan. I figured it was just the storm moving in, nothing unusual. But then I heard something else. At first, it was faint, almost like a thud, followed by the sound of something dragging along the floor. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The noise came again, this time louder. It was coming from upstairs in the loft area. I didn't know what to think. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the house settling, but the noises didn't stop. I stood up and walked cautiously to the stairs, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, straining to listen. The dragging noise was there again, followed by a soft shuffle, like something was moving around in the dark. There was no way anyone else could be here. I hadn't seen another car on the road when I arrived, and the place was supposed to be empty. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing, trying to think of any logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal? But that didn't seem right. No animal could make a sound like that. I had to check. I slowly ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. When I reached the top, I peered into the loft area. It was empty, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then, I noticed something. The window was slightly open, the curtains gently swaying in the breeze. I hadn't opened it, and it was too high up for the wind to have blown it open by itself. I walked over and shut the window, feeling a little foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, something didn't sit right. I checked the rest of the room, but there was nothing unusual. Just a bed and some old furniture, nothing to explain the noises I had heard. I spent the rest of the night uneasy, but nothing else happened. I eventually fell asleep on the couch, the fire long gone, and the house completely silent except for the occasional sound of the wind. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off. I went for a walk in the woods, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The trees were dense, the ground soft with moss, and the light filtered through the canopy above in patches, creating a patchwork of shadow and sunlight. But as I walked, I started to feel like I was being watched. At first, it was subtle, a rustling sound behind me, a shifting of branches I couldn't quite pinpoint. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just an animal or the wind, but the further I went, the more the feeling grew. I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was following me. I turned around several times, but each time there was nothing there. By the time I reached the edge of the woods and saw the cabin in the distance, I was starting to feel panicked. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me, even though I knew no one was supposed to be there. I tried to calm myself down, but the tension wouldn't go away. I couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, too on edge to do anything else. The wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and howling through the trees, and I kept hearing strange noises from upstairs. This time, I didn't even bother to investigate. I knew what I had heard the night before, and I didn't want to know what it was. By morning, I was done. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with the weird noises and the growing sense of dread that was hanging over me. I packed my things quickly, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't even look back as I drove away. The cabin faded from view as I drove down the winding road, the trees closing in around me. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and I didn't even realize how fast I was going until I was halfway home. I thought about the noises, the dragging sounds, the feeling of being watched. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. There had been no one else in the cabin. No footprints outside, no sign of forced entry. It had to have been my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after days of isolation. I haven't been back since, but I'll never forget the feeling of something being there, just out of sight. And for some reason, every time I hear the wind picking up, I wonder if it was all in my head, or if it wasn't. But one thing is certain, I'll never look at an isolated cabin in the woods the same way again. The old cabin stood silently among the trees, shrouded in a dense fog that clung to the ground like a second skin. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the smell of wet pine and earth. I had come up here to get away from everything. Just me and nature, no distractions, no noise, no people. I thought it would be the perfect escape. I had been warned. The locals around the small town at the foot of the mountains had given me strange looks when I asked about the cabin. Some had even advised me to reconsider renting it, but I wasn't interested in their superstitions. I needed silence, and a cabin like this seemed like just the place to find it. The cabin was isolated, far from any roads or nearby houses. The kind of place you could only reach by foot or by driving along a narrow dirt path that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. The owner, an older man with a shaky voice, handed me the key and told me to be careful. I thought little of it. People are always warning you about things, especially when they don't want you to do something. When I arrived, the place was exactly as I expected. A small, single-story structure with a slanted roof and dark wood that looked aged but sturdy. The windows were grimy, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled musty, like something had been sitting undisturbed for far too long. Dust covered the surfaces, and cobwebs clung to the corners. It wasn't unpleasant, though. Felt lived in, though long abandoned. I dropped my bags by the door and locked it behind me. The first night was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The silence was so complete, it felt like the world outside had simply stopped existing. The only sound I could hear was the occasional rustling of the trees, but even that felt distant, muffled by the heavy fog that had settled in the valley. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. It was beautiful in a way untouched by human hands. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest, something I couldn't explain. It was a weight, a pressure, as if the forest was watching me, waiting for me to leave or make a mistake. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, being alone in the wilderness for the first time can play tricks on your mind. That night, I built a fire in the cabin's small stone fireplace and settled in with a book. The crackling flames cast long shadows on the walls, and the warmth felt comforting. Then, as the night deepened, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft tapping. I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the cabin. But then it came again, louder this time. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't wind, it wasn't a branch. It was something else. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just an animal outside, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, grinding noise. I froze, listening. It was coming from the roof. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to check. But the curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me out of my chair and towards the door. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and hesitated, standing there in the quiet cabin, the tapping still echoing above me. I stepped outside onto the small porch, shining the beam of light up toward the roof. The flashlight flickered for a moment before settling on the wooden shingles, and I could see nothing. But the tapping didn't stop. It was louder now, as if something was moving across the roof, dragging its feet. I backed away from the porch, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, the weight of snow or ice shifting on the roof. But then, as I stood there, something caught my eye. A shape, dark and subtle, moved along the edge of the roof. A figure, small but distinct, crouched in the shadows, blending with the dark wood. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, the figure stayed still, almost like it was waiting for me to react. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the trees, disappearing into the fog without a sound. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty roof, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no rational explanation. No wind, no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart was racing. I wanted to go inside, lock the door, and never step foot outside again. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, as the night seemed to grow colder and the air heavier. Eventually, I did go back inside, closing the door behind me with shaking hands. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling didn't leave. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there watching. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my pulse spike. I kept the flashlight on my bedstand, ready to shine it at the smallest noise. But nothing else happened. The rest of the night passed in a strange, uneasy silence. In the morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. I'd been alone too long, my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to spend the next day exploring further into the woods, hoping to clear my head. I gathered my things, put on my jacket, and stepped outside. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. The forest seemed less oppressive, but the unease still lingered. I walked deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, until the trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The silence was almost deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I stopped for a moment, trying to listen for any sound, but there was nothing, not even the birds. That's when I heard it again, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it was definitely there, just beyond my vision. I turned quickly, but saw nothing, just the trees, the empty air. I wasn't sure how much longer I could take this. The isolation was starting to get to me. I needed to leave, but something told me I had to stay, that I hadn't found the answers yet. I made my way back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven. As I approached the door, I noticed something strange. The doorknob was turned, slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I knew I hadn't. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. Something was wrong. But what? I pushed the door open slowly, my heart in my throat. Inside, everything seemed just as I had left it. The furniture, the fireplace, the shelves filled with old books. But there was a subtle change. The dust on the floor was disturbed, like someone had been walking around. Small footprints led from the door to the corner of the room, where a chair had been moved slightly out of place. I stepped inside, feeling the coldness of the room seep into my bones. I couldn't understand it. No one else had been there, or had they? Then, from behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps. Light, quick, but unmistakable. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The door was still closed, the cabin still silent. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, bolted the door behind me, and ran into the woods. I didn't look back. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. The fog was thick again, and the trees closed in around me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. When I finally reached the small road that led back to town, I didn't feel relief. I felt numb. My hands trembled, and my body shook with exhaustion. I didn't stop until I was back in the town, sitting in my car, staring at the road ahead. What had happened in that cabin? What had I seen? What had I heard? The townspeople weren't surprised to see me back early. They simply nodded, their expressions unreadable. The owner of the cabin had left a note for me at the local inn, asking if I'd had a good stay. I never responded. Some things are better left unexplored. I don't know what it was that I felt in that cabin, or who or what had been watching me from the shadows. But I don't need to know, and I don't ever want to go back. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of a secluded cabin in the woods, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life, was exactly what I needed. A few days to clear my head, get some space, and maybe enjoy the silence of nature. The cabin was tucked deep in a forest I knew nothing about, just the way I wanted it.
No neighbors, no distractions.
It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. I'd heard mixed things about it from the small town nearby. Some people said the cabin had a strange vibe, that the area around it wasn't the safest, but that wasn't something I thought much of. People like to exaggerate, right? The guy at the rental office seemed eager to get rid of me. When I asked for directions, he just handed me a map, his eyes darting nervously, but again, I thought little of it. It was probably just a quirky local thing. The drive up to the cabin took longer than expected. The roads were winding and narrow, the trees surrounding me thick and dense. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun had started to dip low in the sky. The air was crisp, but not too cold. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and charming. A stone chimney poked up from the roof, smoke lazily curling into the sky. There was something oddly peaceful about it. I took my bags inside. The cabin was simple, but that's what I liked about it. A couple of rooms, a small kitchen, and a living space with a fireplace. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything I needed. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the smell of aged wood filled the air. The fire in the stove crackled as I stoked it, and soon the warmth spread throughout the room. I was exhausted from the long drive, so after a quick meal of canned soup and crackers, I decided to take a walk around the property to get my bearings. The woods surrounding the cabin were thick, and I could barely see past the first few rows of trees. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, which was exactly the point. But something about the isolation made my skin prickle. I walked along the dirt path behind the cabin, the sounds of nature all around me. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows were growing long. The air seemed colder somehow. The cabin was barely visible through the trees behind me, just a sliver of its silhouette in the dimming light. That's when I heard it. A crack, like a branch snapping or maybe a footstep. It was distant, but it was clear enough to make me pause. I turned, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. I waited for a moment, my heart thumping in my chest. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. The woods were full of them, after all. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease that crept up my spine. I kept walking. I circled the cabin, hoping the exercise would clear my head. But the further I went, the more unsettling the woods felt. The air felt heavier, thicker. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and I swore I could hear something moving just beyond my sight. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but that feeling of being watched lingered. When I got back to the cabin, the sun had set completely, leaving the world outside bathed in darkness. I locked the door behind me, feeling a bit silly for being so paranoid. I made myself another quick meal and sat down to enjoy it, but my mind kept wandering back to the woods. That feeling of unease wouldn't leave. As I settled into bed later that night, I tried to shake off the lingering tension in my body. I turned off the lights and pulled the covers up, hoping to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. At some point during the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the wood. But then it came again, louder this time, a quick, desperate scratching. I sat up, my heart racing. I couldn't move at first, as if my body was frozen. The scratching continued, this time followed by a soft thud against the door, as if something had bumped into it. My mind raced through possibilities, an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. But that didn't make sense. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. The wind howled outside, and I felt my body tense. But the scratching didn't stop. It was constant, rhythmic, as though whatever it was knew exactly where to scratch. I slowly slid out of bed, trying to be as quiet as possible, though every creak of the floorboards felt like it would give me away. My hands were shaking as I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Not yet. I needed to know what was out there first. I crept to the window and peeked out, my flashlight beam sweeping across the porch. There was nothing but the emptiness of the night. But the scratching didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from the back door now, moving slowly, deliberately. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to gather the courage to investigate. But something about it felt wrong. Like if I opened that door, something terrible would happen. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the nearest object, one of the firewood logs, and moved cautiously toward the back door. The scratching stopped suddenly, and I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. The stillness was worse than the sound. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, every sense on edge. Then, slowly, I backed away from the door and sat down by the fireplace, the warmth of the fire doing little to calm my nerves. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, though the feeling of something watching me never quite went away. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. It was hard to believe anything strange had happened the night before. I had almost convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild. I tried to focus on the beauty of the day, on the trees, the birds, the crispness of the air, but something still felt off. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping myself busy with reading and writing. But the fear that had gripped me last night didn't fade. I kept checking the windows, looking out into the woods, feeling that strange sense of unease. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely visible through the thick branches. I stared at it for a long time, hardly daring to blink. It didn't move, just stood there, unmoving. My heart pounded in my chest. Who could it be? Another camper? Someone lost? But why would they be standing so still, just watching? I watched for what felt like an eternity before the figure slowly stepped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. My stomach turned, and the sense of fear that had been simmering inside me all day reached a boiling point. I had to leave. Now, I grabbed my things, throwing them haphazardly into my bag. I didn't care about the mess. I just needed to get out of there. The thought of staying another night in that cabin, knowing that something was out there, was unbearable. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the road, watching me. But there was nothing. Only the trees, the empty road, and the fading cabin in the distance. When I got back to town, I stopped at the same rental office to return the keys. The man behind the counter didn't look up as I placed the keys on the counter, but when he finally did, his eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I turned and left, without a word more. As I drove home, I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head, that I had just been paranoid, letting my imagination get the best of me. But the unease didn't leave. It followed me, clinging to me like a shadow, haunting me. Even now, back in the comfort of my own home, I can't shake the feeling. The scratching, the figure in the woods, the constant feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there, or if I'll ever know, but I know one thing for sure. I will never return to that cabin. It's strange how silence can feel suffocating. I never thought much about it before. Always the background noise of city life, people talking, cars driving, the hum of appliances. But out here, in the cabin, with the trees closing in and the sun dipping behind the hills, silence is different. Presses in on me, heavy and thick. The cabin isn't much, just a small two-room building on the edge of the woods. It's not even a true cabin, really. A house built for a weekend retreat, but over the years, the lack of maintenance turned it into something closer to a forgotten shelter. The roof leaks in places, and the windows, old and warped, creak when the wind hits them just right. But it's enough. It's been just me here for the last 3 days, and it's been strangely peaceful. Well, for the most part. I came out here to get away from everything. Work, stress, and the constant noise of life. I thought a few days alone would help me clear my head. But now that I'm here, I realize I might have underestimated how isolating it could be. It's not that I'm scared. Not exactly. But there's something about this place that feels wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but every creak of the floorboard or gust of wind seems louder than it should be. I'm not used to being so alone. I thought I'd enjoy the peace, but it feels like the quiet is watching me. Last night, I sat in front of the fireplace with a book. The flames crackled and popped, throwing long, dancing shadows across the walls. But after a while, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting, wondering about the sound outside. Footsteps. Maybe? I told myself it was just an animal, something small, maybe a deer or a raccoon, just sniffing around. But the more I listened, the less certain I was. There were no tracks outside the cabin when I checked in the morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me. It's only when the sun starts to set that the unease grows stronger. The trees surrounding the cabin, tall and dark, seem to close in on the space. The shadows stretch, the breeze picks up, and I can hear branches scraping against the roof. Everything seems alive, moving, whispering. There's something about the way the wind moves through the trees that feels almost deliberate, as if the woods are speaking in their own language, trying to tell me something I can't understand. I go outside to get some fresh air, to clear my head, but it's colder than I expect. The air has a bite to it, and I'm thankful I brought a jacket. I step onto the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel. The woods stretch out in front of me, silent and dark. I listen for anything out of the ordinary, but I can't hear much. Just the wind rustling the leaves and the distant sound of an owl. I walk around the side of the cabin, just to keep my mind occupied. The ground is uneven, and the trees seem to lean in closer, their branches twisting and reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. It's almost as though the forest is reclaiming the space, fighting to take back what humans had once built. I'm about to head back inside when I spot something in the distance, just a flicker of movement. It's hard to tell what it is from here, but it looks like a shadow darting between the trees. Maybe it's a deer, maybe. But as I watch, I get the feeling it's something bigger, something deliberate. My stomach tightens. My instincts scream at me to go inside, to lock the door and stay safe. But I don't move. I stay there, rooted to the spot, staring at the darkening woods. The shadow is gone now, but the unease lingers. When I get back to the cabin, I check the doors and windows, making sure they're locked. I've never been the paranoid type, but I can't shake this feeling that I'm not alone. I sit in the living room for a while, staring into the fire, but it's hard to concentrate. The shadows on the walls look different now. They don't just flicker, they seem to shift, to move, as if they're trying to tell me something. I don't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, makes me jump. I pull the blankets tighter around me, telling myself it's just my imagination. But I know it's more than that. The house feels different tonight. Heavy somehow, like it's not just the wind outside. It's something inside, pressing down on me. Around midnight, there's a knock at the door. It's soft at first, almost like a tap. My heart skips a beat and I freeze. I don't move for a few moments, my mind racing. Who could be out there? The nearest neighbor is miles away. I don't even know anyone else in the area. Could it be someone lost? Or worse, someone who knows I'm alone? The knock comes again, louder this time. 3 knocks. I feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'm not sure what to do. Should I open the door? What if it's someone who needs help? Or what if it's something worse? The silence after the knock is unbearable. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, I get up and walk cautiously toward the door. I don't open it right away. Instead, I peer through the crack in the window next to the door, trying to make out any shape or movement in the dark. But there's nothing. No one. Just the blackness of the night. I take a deep breath and unlock the door, slowly pulling it open. There's no one there. Not a soul. The porch is empty, the gravel still and quiet. I step outside, scanning the area, my pulse quickening. The air feels colder now. The wind picks up, and I can hear the branches creaking overhead. I stand there for a moment, wondering if I imagined the whole thing, but then I see something. A small object on the ground, just in front of the door. It's a piece of wood, a stick with something carved into it. I bend down to get a closer look. The markings are strange, nothing I recognize. It looks like scratches, deep, deliberate. I don't know why, but a chill runs down my spine as I stare at it. My instincts scream at me again, telling me to go inside, to lock the door, to forget this whole place. But I stand there, frozen, staring at the markings. I pick it up, and that's when I hear it. A sound not far from me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel. My heart stops. My breath catches. I turn slowly, my eyes scanning the trees again. This time I can see something. A figure, tall and thin, standing between 2 trees. It's hard to make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the fading light. But it's there, watching. I don't know how long I stand there, paralyzed, but eventually, the figure disappears into the woods. I'm left standing on the porch, staring after it, my hands trembling. The woods are still, silent. I don't think about it anymore after that. I don't want to. The next morning, I pack up and leave. I don't even finish the coffee I made or take a proper look around. I just get in the car, start the engine, and drive away as fast as I can. The road seems endless, and I don't stop until I'm well out of the woods, back on the highway. Even as I pull into my driveway hours later, I still feel the weight of the forest pressing on me. The strange feeling that something was watching, something that wasn't quite human. I don't know who or what it was, but I know one thing. I'm never going back to that cabin again. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. The idea had sounded perfect when I first heard about the cabin in the woods. My friends and I were craving an escape from the city, a quiet place where we could unplug and unwind. None of us were particularly outdoorsy, but we all agreed that a weekend of solitude in a small, rustic cabin would be the perfect retreat. The cabin wasn't exactly isolated, but it was far enough from civilization that we wouldn't hear cars or see streetlights at night. It was tucked into the side of a forest, surrounded by trees that seemed ancient. their trunks thick with age and bark that cracked like dried leather when the wind blew. We drove out on Friday afternoon, the drive taking us longer than we expected, the sun dipping lower in the sky as we reached the gravel road that led to the cabin. At first, the place seemed charming. A small, single-story building made of weathered wood, with a tin roof and a stone chimney. There were large windows that overlooked the woods, and the front porch was wide enough to sit on, with a few old rocking chairs that looked like they'd been there for years. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. Wooden floors, a big stone fireplace, and a small kitchen with all the essentials. The furniture was old, mismatched, but comfortable enough. There was a single bathroom, a couple of bedrooms, and a small living room area with a couch and a few chairs. We unpacked, started a fire in the fireplace, and cracked open some beers. We joked about the eerie vibe the place gave off. Something about the silence around the cabin made it feel strange, but no one said anything about it. It was just a feeling, not enough to make us think twice. The sun set, and soon the only light we had was from the fire and a few lamps inside the cabin. We sat around, told stories, and laughed, enjoying the peace. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just a general unease that seemed to seep into my bones. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone standing just outside, watching us. But every time I looked, the yard was empty, the trees casting long shadows under the light of the full moon. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The others headed to their rooms, and I stayed up a little longer, staring into the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting odd shapes on the walls. Every now and then, I heard a twig snap or a branch rustle outside, but I told myself it was just the wind. I finally went to bed, locking the door behind me. The room I was staying in was small, with a single bed covered in an old quilt. The window next to the bed faced out into the woods, and I couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable knowing how dark it was out there. I pulled the covers over me, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear something. A faint scratching noise, like nails against wood, coming from outside. At first, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel climbing the trees. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed to get louder, closer, until I could almost feel it pressing against the window. I got up and peeked out the glass, but there was nothing there, just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. It was nothing, I told myself. But that night, the noises continued. I tossed and turned in bed, hearing them scratching, tapping, and the occasional soft thud, as if something or someone was moving around outside. I tried to drown it out, pulling the blanket over my head, but sleep wouldn't come. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, the sunlight creeping through the cracks in the blinds woke me up. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, the events of the night still fresh in my mind. I told myself it was just nerves, that I had overreacted. After all, I was in a cabin in the middle of a forest. Of course, there would be strange noises. But when I went downstairs and saw the others, I noticed something strange. They looked tired, pale, like they hadn't slept either. We all gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast, and everyone seemed a bit off. No one really wanted to talk about it, but the tension in the air was palpable. I wasn't the only one who had heard the noises. We should probably go for a hike today, one of my friends suggested, trying to break the silence. Get some fresh air. We all agreed it would be a good idea, so after breakfast, we bundled up and headed out into the woods. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was crisp, which made the whole situation feel even more surreal. We walked for hours, the trees stretching high above us, blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, until the only sounds were our footsteps crunching in the dry leaves and the occasional bird call. At some point, I noticed that we had wandered pretty far from the cabin. The forest here looked different, darker, with thicker underbrush and tangled vines. The trees were more twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. It didn't feel right, but no one said anything, so I kept my thoughts to myself. We finally stopped to take a break by a small clearing. There was a stream running through it, the water sparkling in the sunlight. We sat down on the rocks and took out some snacks, trying to ignore the fact that the forest around us seemed oddly quiet.
No birds.
No rustling animals, just the sound of the water flowing. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flash of movement between the trees, something darker than the shadows, but it was gone so quickly that I couldn't tell if I'd really seen anything at all. I looked around at the others, but they were talking, laughing, not paying attention. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just a deer or a bear, something harmless. But then I saw it again. This time it wasn't a flash. It was more deliberate. Someone was standing just beyond the trees, watching us. My stomach dropped. I stood up, heart pounding, but the figure was gone again before I could say anything. I was about to call out to the others, but I stopped myself. What if it was just my mind playing tricks on me? I wasn't sure. "Hey, you okay?" one of my friends asked, noticing the look on my face. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," I said, trying to sound casual. "Probably just a deer," they replied, dismissing it. We stayed for a while longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When we finally decided to head back to the cabin, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the shadows. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the unease never left. As night fell, we built another fire and sat around it, but the same tension lingered in the air. Everyone was on edge, though no one admitted it. We stayed up a little later than usual, but eventually we all retired to our rooms. That night, the sounds started again. I could hear the same scratching, tapping noises outside my window, only now they were louder, almost frantic. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay there, frozen, too scared to move, too scared to look outside. The sound was relentless, growing louder and more urgent with every passing minute. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like something had struck the cabin. I jumped out of bed, my breath shallow and quick. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept toward the window, shining the beam outside. For a moment, I saw nothing, but then, just beyond the trees, I saw a figure standing there. It wasn't close to the cabin, but it was definitely watching. I could see its shape clearly now, a tall, thin silhouette against the moonlit trees. My heart raced as I backed away from the window. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to alarm the others, but I also didn't want to be alone if something or someone was out there. I made a decision. I needed to check outside. I couldn't stay in the cabin and do nothing. I grabbed the door handle slowly and pulled it open. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I stepped outside, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The night was dead silent now, all the sounds of the forest gone. I scanned the trees, but there was no one. The figure was gone. I didn't stay outside long. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I was shaken, my hands trembling as I tried to calm myself down. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I couldn't wait to leave. The strange figure, the constant noises, it was too much. But when I went downstairs, everyone else was packing, too. They had all felt it, the same unease, the same fear. We agreed it was time to go, to leave the cabin and the woods behind us. We drove back to the city in silence, the weight of the experience still heavy on all of us. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important. The figure I saw, the noises, the sense that we were being watched. Something was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. I tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That cabin, something about it was off, and I'd never go back again. The drive to the cabin was long and uneventful, a straight shot through the winding, empty roads of the backwoods. My car hummed steadily, the only sound besides the occasional crunch of tires over loose gravel. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, a break from the city, from work, from people. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin itself sat at the end of a dirt trail, tucked into the forest like a secret. It was small and unassuming, with faded wooden walls and a sloping roof. The surrounding trees were dense and tall, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. As I stepped out of the car, the air hit me, crisp, cold, and smelling faintly of pine. I felt a shiver run through me, but it wasn't entirely unpleasant. This was what I needed. Isolation, quiet, a chance to clear my head. The interior of the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed pushed against one wall, a small kitchenette, and a fireplace in the corner. There was a bathroom, thankfully, but no running water. A large metal basin and a few buckets suggested I'd need to fetch water from the nearby stream. I'd read about it in the listing, but hadn't given it much thought until now. Unpacking didn't take long. I'd brought the essentials: food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a few books. I set everything up quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. The light in the forest was already starting to fade, casting long shadows across the ground. By the time I had the small kerosene lantern lit and placed on the table, the cabin felt cozy in a way that made me smile. I hadn't smiled much in the past few months. This felt good. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some instant noodles on the portable stove and read by the light of the lantern until my eyes grew heavy. Outside, the forest was alive with sound: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was a comforting kind of noise, like the world was reminding me it was still there, even in the middle of nowhere. I fell asleep easily, the thin mattress surprisingly comfortable. The next morning, I woke up early, the pale light of dawn filtering through the small window above the bed. The air was colder than I expected, my breath visible in small puffs as I moved around the cabin. I dressed quickly, layering up against the chill, and decided to explore the area a bit before breakfast. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. The trees seemed taller, their bark rough and textured beneath my fingertips. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of moss and damp wood. I followed a faint trail that led away from the cabin, winding deeper into the woods. It wasn't long before I found the stream mentioned in the listing. It was narrow but fast-moving, the water clear and cold. I crouched down to fill one of the buckets I'd brought, watching as the sunlight danced on the surface. As I stood up, bucket in hand, I noticed something strange: a series of scratches on a tree trunk nearby. They were deep and uneven, like something had clawed at the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over them. They didn't look like they'd been made by an animal, at least not any animal I could think of. They were too deliberate, too human. Shaking off the unease creeping up my spine, I made my way back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I spent most of it reading, only venturing outside to gather more water or stretch my legs. The scratches on the tree lingered in the back of my mind, but I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. Probably just some bored hiker or a prank from the locals. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I'd managed to convince myself it was nothing. That night, the forest felt different. The sounds that had lulled me to sleep the night before seemed distant, almost muted. I told myself it was just the wind, the temperature dropping as the night set in. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I double-checked the lock on the door before climbing into bed, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I stared at them until sleep finally took me. A noise woke me in the middle of the night, a sharp, distinct sound that cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't the creak of the cabin settling or the rustle of leaves outside. It was closer, louder. My heart was pounding as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was coming from outside. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Maybe it was a branch falling or an animal rummaging around. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees just beyond the cabin. First, I didn't see anything. Then, movement, a shadow shifting just out of reach of the flashlight's glow. My breath caught. It was too big to be an animal. Human, then, but who and why? Panic surged through me as I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Should I confront them? Call out? No, that would be stupid. I didn't even have cell service out here. I locked the door earlier, I was sure of it. But the windows, they didn't have locks, just flimsy latches. I decided to wait it out. Whoever it was, they'd move on. They had to. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, ears straining for any sign of movement. The sound of my own breathing was deafening, every creak of the cabin making me jump. Hours seemed to pass before I finally drifted off again, exhaustion overriding fear. When morning came, the first thing I did was check outside. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed ground. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream. But I knew better. The unease from the previous day was back, stronger now. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. I spent the day preparing to leave. I packed up my things, made sure the car was ready to go, and even filled an extra gas can just in case. But as the sun began to set, I realized I'd have to spend one more night here. Driving these roads in the dark was a risk I wasn't willing to take. That final night was the worst. The noises started again, soft at first, then louder, more deliberate. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow and measured. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. At one point, I thought I heard the faint sound of breathing, close enough to make my skin crawl. But I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, the noises stopped and silence returned. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn broke, I didn't waste any time. I threw my bags in the car and started the engine, the relief almost overwhelming as I pulled away from the cabin. The drive back to civilization felt like it took forever, the narrow forest roads stretching on endlessly. But when I finally saw the highway up ahead, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the scratches. They were on the car this time, deep grooves etched into the paint of the driver's side door. My stomach dropped as I stared at them, the memories of the past 2 nights flooding back. Whatever had been out there hadn't just been watching me. It had been closer than I'd thought. I never reported it. What would I even say? Instead, I put the whole experience behind me, vowing never to set foot in that forest again. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, a retreat from the chaos of everyday life. Instead, it became a reminder of how fragile that peace can be and how quickly it can be shattered. I'm not sure why I thought it would be a good idea to head to the cabin alone. Maybe it was the promise of peace and quiet, a chance to clear my head. Life in the city had been overwhelming lately, and the idea of disconnecting from everything sounded like the perfect remedy. So, when my friend offered me the use of his family's remote cabin in the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. The drive out there was uneventful, though the roads became narrower and more desolate the further I went. Trees lined the path on both sides, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived, but the instructions my friend had given me were straightforward. Turn left at the old wooden sign, drive 3 miles down the dirt road, and there it was. The cabin itself was modest, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. It looked like something out of a postcard. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a single chimney. There was a shed a few yards away, which I assumed held tools or firewood. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and made my way inside. The interior was cozy but dated. The living room had a stone fireplace, a worn-out couch, and a wooden coffee table. The kitchen was small but functional, with a gas stove, a mini fridge, and shelves stocked with canned goods and dry food. There was one bedroom and a bathroom, everything I needed for a short getaway. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area. The woods were dense, the trees towering and ancient. A narrow path wound its way through the forest, and I followed it for a while. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional crack of a branch, the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying sense of isolation that was hard to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I told myself it was just my imagination. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the cabin. The temperature dropped quickly, and I was glad for the stack of firewood by the fireplace. I started a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled into the couch with a book. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly relaxed. The first night passed without incident. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birdsong. After breakfast, I decided to venture further into the woods. I brought a map my friend had left in the cabin, which marked a few points of interest: a small stream, an old hunting tower, and a clearing with a great view of the surrounding hills. I planned to visit all three. The stream was easy to find, its clear water bubbling over smooth stones. I spent some time there enjoying the tranquility. The hunting tower was less inviting. It was old and rickety, its wooden beams weathered and splintered. I climbed it anyway, the structure creaking with every step. From the top, I had a decent view of the forest, though the thick canopy obscured much of the ground below. I didn't stay long. The clearing was the furthest point, and getting there was more challenging than I expected. The trail became less defined, and I had to push through dense underbrush. When I finally arrived, the view was worth it. The hills stretched out before me, the forest a sea of green that seemed endless. I stayed for a while, taking it all in before starting back. It was on the way back that things began to feel off. The forest seemed quieter than before. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the unease that was settling over me. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I'd spent too much time in the city, where silence was rare. Out here, it was probably normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint at first, just the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical. They stopped by the front porch, and I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the footsteps moved away and disappeared into the woods. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. Someone had been out there. I tried to convince myself it was a hiker who'd wandered too close, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The cabin was too remote. I spent the day inside, uneasy and on edge. I kept the doors locked and stayed near the fireplace, where I felt safest. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe the tracks had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They banged on the walls of the cabin, rattled the doorknob, and stomped across the porch. I sat in the living room, clutching a fireplace poker, my heart racing. The banging continued for what felt like an eternity before everything went silent. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. As I walked to the driver's side, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden door of the cabin were the words, "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and spent the night there, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I called my friend to tell him what had happened. He seemed genuinely shocked and apologized profusely, insisting that nothing like this had ever happened before. He promised to look into it and let me know if he found anything, but I told him I didn't want to know. I just wanted to put the whole experience behind me. I never went back to that cabin, and I've avoided remote places ever since. Whatever or whoever was out there that night, I'm just glad I listened to the warning and left. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away, a break from the chaos of the city. I had found the cabin online, tucked deep in the woods about 4 hours from where I lived. The photos showed a quaint wooden structure, perched by a lake with mist curling off the water in the mornings. It seemed perfect, quiet, secluded, and exactly what I needed to clear my head. I arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun low in the sky and the trees casting long shadows across the dirt road. The driveway to the cabin was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, and the trees seemed to close in the further I drove. By the time the cabin came into view, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. But I shook it off. This was the solitude I had wanted. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, but cozy. A single-story structure with a sloped roof and a small porch. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood and something metallic I couldn't place. The furniture was old but functional. A couch with frayed edges, a wooden dining table, and a fireplace stacked with logs. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, and my cell phone barely had a signal. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. After unpacking my bag and putting away the groceries I'd brought, I stepped outside to take in the surroundings. The lake was as beautiful as the photos had promised. A still expanse of water reflecting the fiery orange and pink of the setting sun. The forest around me was dense, the kind of place where sounds were muffled and time seemed to slow. A small dock extended out over the water, and I made a mental note to sit there in the morning with a cup of coffee. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was too soft, the sheets smelled faintly musty, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but it was hard to relax. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like faint footsteps outside the window. My heart raced as I strained to listen, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I didn't dare get up to look. Instead, I pulled the blanket over my head like a child and waited for sleep to take me. By morning, I felt foolish. The sunlight streaming through the windows made everything seem less menacing. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Determined to shake off the unease, I brewed a pot of coffee and took my mug down to the dock. The air was cool and crisp, and the lake was eerily calm, not even a ripple disturbing its surface. I sat there for a while, letting the silence wash over me. It was peaceful, but there was a strange tension in the air, like the woods were watching me. I spent most of the day exploring the area. There were no marked trails, so I stuck close to the cabin, wandering through the trees and trying to familiarize myself with the surroundings. At one point, I found an old, rusted shovel half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years. I leaned it against a tree and kept walking, but the sight of it stayed with me. Who had left it there, and why? As the sun began to set, I returned to the cabin. The unease from the night before started creeping back in. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. To distract myself, I lit a fire in the fireplace and opened a book. The flames crackled and the cabin filled with a comforting warmth. For a while, I managed to forget my fears, but that night the noises started again. This time they were louder, scraping sounds like something being dragged across the ground, followed by faint thuds. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body tense. The sounds were coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated whether to investigate. Part of me wanted to stay under the covers, but another part knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I knew what was out there. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought and crept to the back door. My hand trembled as I turned the handle and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and the darkness was absolute, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating it. I scanned the area, my ears straining for any sound. The noises had stopped. There was nothing but the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hoot of an owl. Just as I was about to go back inside, the flashlight caught something on the ground. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the woods to the back of the cabin. My stomach churned as I followed them, the beam of light shaking in my unsteady hand. The tracks stopped abruptly near the corner of the cabin, as if whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, no matter how small, set my nerves on edge. I kept the flashlight by my side and the bedroom door locked, even though I knew it wouldn't do much good if someone really wanted to get in. When morning finally came, I felt like a wreck. My initial excitement about the trip had been replaced by a gnawing dread. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to give in to my fear. I told myself I was overreacting, that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. The third day was overcast, the sky a dull gray that made the forest feel even more oppressive. I decided to stay close to the cabin, chopping some wood and tidying up to keep myself busy. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance up, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, but there was never anyone there. That night, the noises came back, louder and more insistent. It wasn't just scraping and thuds this time. There was also a strange tapping, like someone was knocking on the walls of the cabin. I stayed in bed, clutching the flashlight and trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew better. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door handle rattling. My blood turned to ice. Someone was trying to get in. I held my breath, my mind racing. The door was locked, but the cabin wasn't exactly a fortress. If they wanted to break in, it wouldn't take much effort. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the creak of the wooden porch. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time, as if they wanted me to know they were there. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and everything went quiet again. I stayed awake until dawn, every nerve in my body on high alert. When the first light of day filtered through the windows, I finally mustered the courage to go outside. There were no footprints this time, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I wasn't imagining things. The sense of isolation that had drawn me to the cabin now felt like a trap. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things as quickly as I could and loaded them into the car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and unyielding, and the narrow dirt road stretching out ahead. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The tension in my chest began to ease, and the knots in my stomach loosened. I don't know what was out there in those woods, but I'm certain it wasn't my imagination. Something or someone had been watching me, and I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted. I've thought about that weekend a lot since then, replaying every detail in my mind and trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a prank, some local kids messing with the out-of-towner. Or maybe it was something darker, something I'm better off not knowing. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin, and I'll never look at the woods the same way again.